Hello everybody, welcome to my very first video on this channel. If you've never seen my face before, hi, I'm Amy. I'm very anxious. This is my very first true crime channel. I've been wanting to talk about true crime for years. I find true crime so interesting. I would like to get into serial killers' minds and try to figure out why they did what they did. And I just love learning about history and what people have gone through. So that being said, we're just gonna jump straight into the case today because it's a very, very long one. It took me 3.5 days to do research on this case. There's just so much information. I was going to do my makeup while talking about this case, but this case is so long. I'll be done my makeup probably not even halfway through the case. This case is really hard to hear, so before we get into it, I'm going to give a little bit of a content warning. This video will be containing essay, abuse, torture, murder, a whole bunch of things. Everything that you can think of is in this case, and it's very, very hard to hear. If any of that is too much for you, please click out of today's video. I will come back next week with a new case. Hopefully that will be suitable for you. So let's get started. Theodore Robert Cowell was born on November 24th, 1949, making him a Sagittarius. His mother was named Eleanor Louise Cowell, but for today's video, we're going to be referring to her as Louise. In the first 2 months of his life, he was living with his mother in a home for unwed mothers. Nobody really knows who Ted Bundy's father was, but there is a lot of speculation onto who he might be, but we're going to get into that a little bit later. After 2 months of living in the home for unwed mothers, Louise's father got in contact with Louise and convinced her to move back to Philadelphia to their home. Louise's parents, Ted's grandparents, were a very religious family, and they took their religion very, very seriously. Because Louise was unmarried and had a child, this could ruin their reputation in their neighborhood. So, to prevent this, Ted grew up to think that his grandparents were his actual parents and Louise was his sister. From the outside looking in, it seemed like they had a very normal home, like a very normal family. But behind closed doors, it was a completely different story. Ted's grandmother suffered from severe depression and agoraphobia. His grandfather was extremely abusive. Going back to the speculation of who Ted's father might actually be, it's speculated that Louise was sexually assaulted by her own father, and Ted's father, biological father, is Louise's father. Louise denied these claims, saying that she got seduced by a veteran and then he just left and they never talked again. But we will never know who Ted's father really was. And I don't think he's going to want to come out and talk and say, hey, Ted was actually my son. If I was his biological father, I would keep quiet too. So at the age of 3, Louise decided that it was best to move from the Philadelphia home to Tacoma, Washington. Ted was very upset about this move. He did not want to move from Philadelphia at all, but eventually they did move to Tacoma, Washington. While living in Tacoma, Washington, Louise met a man named Johnny Bundy. Later that same year, they actually got married. Eventually, Johnny adopted Ted, giving him the last name Bundy. Johnny and Louise went on to have 4 more children. Johnny tried his best to make Ted feel as included in the family as possible, always made sure that he would love all the kids all of the same, like Ted was no different from the other children. Ted made it very clear that he was not happy with Johnny, and Ted was into materialistic things. And because Johnny didn't have a lot of money and didn't make a lot of money at being a hospital cook, he was very upset about this, making it well known. While still living in Tacoma, Washington, still a very, very young age, Ted would go through neighbors' trash bins to find pornography magazines. He also had a big fascination with true crime. He would also look through people's windows in hopes to find women undressing. Mind you, he was still very, very young, so this is a red flag. Also, I forgot to say in the beginning, before she moved from Philadelphia to Tacoma, Louise's sister, Ted's aunt, woke up to Ted putting knives around her while she slept. And Ted laughed about this, and everybody in the family literally dismissed this. Did I mention that he was only 3 years old? I mean, I have a 3-year-old. My son wouldn't get into knives. Like, that would be a problem. I'd be like, hey, knives are dangerous, you know what I mean? But I understand, like, he's only 3. Like, he doesn't have any bad intentions at that time. But also, a red flag. Like, in high school, Ted thought of himself as a loner, that he couldn't get any women, and that he never really tried to get women, as he didn't really know what to do with them if he were to get a girl. But peers of Ted said that he was very well liked in school and that he was very polite and handsome. So, who knows? In 1965, Ted graduated high school. He then attended the University of Puget Sound for 1 year before transferring to the University of Washington to study Chinese. In 1967, Ted met a woman named Diane Edwards, known as Stephanie Brooks. They quickly got into a relationship together, but sadly, this relationship never lasted long, because a year later, Diane called it quits on the relationship, saying that he was very immature and seemed like he had no life aspirations. After the breakup, she eventually dropped out of the university that they both went to, and she moved back to California with her parents. This is thought to be where Ted started his downward spiral. Bundy apparently took this breakup very hard. He decided that it was best to clear his mind and go travel for a bit, so he went to Colorado. Then he visited relatives in Arkansas before going to Philadelphia. That's where he enrolled himself in Temple University. During this time, it's believed he found out about his birth certificate. I'm going to explain that a little bit because I didn't really write much down about this, but basically he found his birth certificate, and on the birth certificate it usually says mother and then father, but for father it says unknown. So he found out that his whole life was a lie, that his mother lied to him for all these years, and he found out that basically that his sister was his mother and that his parents were his actual grandparents. So this really messed him up. Back in Washington, Ted met a woman named Elizabeth Klepfer, a single mother from Utah. Working as a secretary at the University of Washington School for Medicine, started a relationship fairly quickly. She later on came out saying that he was very sweet, very handsome, and she never saw any of this coming. Like, he was very loving towards her, and all of this was a big shock for her, as he was a very, very polite man, which is, ugh. I don't know. I just felt so, like, weird about writing that down. I'm like, what? There was no red flags in this man? Oh, anyways. In 1970, Ted re-enrolled himself in the University of Washington as a psychology major. He was highly respected by peers and by his professors. And in 1971, Ted got a job at a suicide hotline crisis center. What? There, he met a woman named Ann Rule, former Seattle police officer. She also later came out saying that there was no red flags that she saw from Ted. She was a police officer and she didn't see any red flags. In 1972, Ted graduated from university. And during that same year, Elizabeth got pregnant with Ted's child. But they both agreed that it wasn't a good time to have children, so they decided to terminate the pregnancy. And also again, later on, Elizabeth said that he was very nice during this time, was very empathetic and understanding of what she was going through. In 1973, while still in a relationship with Elizabeth, Ted rekindled his relationship with Diane. Also during that year, he enrolled himself into the University of Utah. He then abruptly broke up with Diane as revenge. Petty. Right after they broke up though, he dropped out of university. Oh, I forgot to say, in the University of Utah, he was studying law, so that's important for later. This is when he started his horrific crimes, so please be cautious, and if you need to stop right here, that is completely understandable. Take care of yourself. So there are a lot of crimes that we're gonna have to go through, so I'm gonna quickly read them to you and then we'll move on, because there's just so much. I can't sit through all of them and explain each one. There's just so many, so I'm just gonna read them straight from my book and we'll move on to the stuff afterwards. I hope that doesn't bother you. There's just so many that I have to get through and my camera's already dying, so we gotta be quick. Okay, hold on. That candle is literally making me choke. Like, I'm literally choking on that candle scent right now. I'm not okay. Send help. Shortly after midnight on January 4th, 1974, Ted entered the basement apartment of 18-year-old Karen Sparks. Once inside, he bludgeoned her with a metal rod that he got from her bed frame. He then either used the same rod that he hit her with or a speculum, but he sexually assaulted her right after with a metal rod, causing several internal injuries. Karen was unconscious for 10 days. Amazingly, she survived this ordeal, but was left with permanent disabilities, physically and mentally. In the early hours of February 1st, 1974, Ted broke into the basement room of 21-year-old Linda Ann Healy. He proceeded to beat her unconscious, then dressed her in blue jeans, a white blouse, and boots before taking her and kidnapping her. Linda would be Ted's first confirmed murder. Her remains were found near a mountainside. On March 12, 1974, 19-year-old Donna Gail Manson left her dorm to go attend a jazz concert on campus, but she never arrived. Her remains were never found. On April 17, 1974, 18-year-old Susan Elaine Rancourt vanished on her way back to her dorm. Her remains were later found around the same mountainside. I'm just going to read it from now on so it's quicker. On May 6, 1974, 22-year-old Roberta Kathleen Parks left her dorm at Oregon State University to have coffee with some friends, but never made it there. Her remains were also found at that same mountainside. The police at this point were becoming very frustrated and concerned for these women. No evidence to point to what actually happened to these women. There's nothing that connected these women together, except for them having long brown hair split down the middle. On June 1st, 1974, 22-year-old Brenda Carol Ball vanished near an airport. Last seen talking to a man in a parking lot with brown hair and his arm in a sling. Her remains again were found at that same mountainside. 1 year later, in the early hours of June 11, 1974, 18-year-old Georgianne Hawkins vanished after walking down an alleyway. Ted lured her to his car before using a crowbar, knocking her unconscious. He then handcuffed her and drove her to Issaquah, where he strangled her to death. He actually left her body there. He confessed later on that he went back to visit her 3 separate times. He even confessed to visiting the alleyway that she was abducted the next morning during the investigation to collect her earrings and her one shoe, and was never caught for this. Witnesses came forward to claim they saw a man in an alleyway with crutches, struggling to carry his briefcase, then proceeded to ask her for help in getting his briefcase in the car, a tan or beige Volkswagen Beetle. During this time, Ted was working in Olympia as the assistant director of the Seattle Crime Prevention Advisory Commission. I might have said that wrong. Then eventually got into the Department of Emergency Services. If you see me looking down, I'm reading my notes because this is a lot of information that I just cannot remember. This agency actually helped in the search for these missing women Are you hearing this shit? There he met a woman named Carol Ann Boone. They fell for each other very quickly and eventually started a relationship, while he was still with Elizabeth. Also during this time, the disappearances went public. All the police knew at this point was it was a man with brown hair in an arm sling driving a tan or beige Volkswagen Beetle, and that all the kidnappings happened at night. Everything changed in the investigation on July 14th, 1974 at Lake Sammamish. 2 women were abducted in broad daylight with thousands of people visiting this lake that day. 5 witnesses came forward saying that a man in a tennis outfit came up to them asking for help in unloading his sailboat from his Volkswagen. 4 women said no. 1 woman agreed. As she approached his car, she quickly realized there was no sailboat, and she quickly ran away. Then approached a 23-year-old girl named Janice Ott and was eventually seen leaving the beach with him. Then only 4 hours later, 19-year-old Denise Naslund left the picnic to go to the restroom but never returned. Ted later said that Janice was still alive when he kidnapped Denise, and he made one of them watch as he killed the other. He later retracted this, but knowing him, he probably did this. With this new information, police had enough info to make a sketch. Elizabeth Klepfer, Ann Rule, and the professor of the University of Utah seen this sketch and automatically thought that it was Ted. Elizabeth told police to look into her boyfriend, that he visited Lake Sammamish the same day that these 2 women were abducted. Police was reluctant to even look into him as he had a perfect record and that he was a law student. The police basically dismissed this. On September 2nd, 1974, Ted raped and strangled an identified hitchhiker in Idaho. Her remains were never found. September the 6th, 1974, 2 hunters found the skeletal remains of Janice Ott and Denise Naslund on a surface road 2 miles from where they were abducted. 2 more skeletal parts were found, which Ted said that were George Ann Hawkins. 6 months after, more remains were discovered and identified as other missing women. At this point, police realized that all these cases were connected. October 2nd, 1974, Ted attacked and murdered 16-year-old Nancy Wilcox. He buried her remains near Capitol Reef National Park, but they were never recovered. On October 11th, 1974, 22-year-old Rhonda Sapley was waiting for a bus to get back to her dorm. Ted pulled up and asked if she needed a ride, because she accepted this offer. On the drive there, they apparently had a very good conversation. They were just getting to know each other. When Ted missed the turn, she corrected him saying, "You're going the wrong way," but he said, "Hey, I need to run an errand first. Is that okay?" And she agreed. He proceeded to take her to Cottonwood Canyon and began strangling her, knocking her unconscious. She woke up minutes later to Ted slapping her across the face as he strangled her once again. He did this 5 or 6 times before waking her back up and raping her, then proceeded to strangle her again. When she woke up again, Ted was looking in his car for a crowbar and Rhonda escaped. She fell into a fast-running river and she drifted away. She finally got out of the water and ran, and she escaped Ted Bundy. On October 18, 1974, Melissa Ann Smith, the daughter of the police chief, vanished. Her naked body was found 9 days later in a nearby mountain area. It's believed she was alive for 7 days after disappearing, but was beaten, raped, and strangled by a nylon stocking. On October 31st, 17-year-old Laura Ann Aimee also vanished after midnight in Utah. Her body was found naked on Thanksgiving 9 miles northeast of American Fork Canyon. She was beaten so badly her father could only identify her by the scars on her arms from where a horse had thrown her into barbed wire at age 11. Ted shampooed their hair and applied makeup to their faces after they died. On November the 8th, 1974, Ted approached 18-year-old Carol DeRanche at Fashion Place Mall in Murray, Utah, and identified himself as a police officer and claimed that someone attempted to break into Carol's car. Even though her car seemed fine, Ted convinced her to go back to make a report at the police station. While driving, Carol realized they weren't going in the right direction to the police station. Carol told him that he was going the wrong way, and he quickly pulled over and attempted to handcuff her. During this struggle, though, Ted accidentally handcuffed the same hand twice, which led to Carol jumping out of the car and running to safety. Later that day, though, 17-year-old Deborah Jean Kent vanished 20 miles from where Carol was attacked. After leaving school to pick her brother up, she vanished. Her remains weren't identified for 41 years. While looking for evidence, police found a key that would later be found to unlock Carol's wrist. In November of that same year, Elizabeth was putting the pieces together. She's like, hey, wherever Ted goes, the vanishes, the disappearances, the murders go. She was doing her own investigation. She realized this man was up to something nasty. She then again called the police. They officially put him as a suspect. In January of 1975, he returned to Seattle, Washington from Utah to visit Elizabeth. On January 12, 1975, 23-year-old Karen Eileen Campbell vanished in the hallway at the Woodland Inn in Snowmass Village. Her naked body was found 1 month later just outside the resort. She was killed by a blunt force trauma to the head. On March 15, 1975, 26-year-old Julie Cunningham was leaving her apartment to have lunch with a friend when Ted approached her with crutches, asking if she could help him carry his ski boots to his car. He then clubbed and handcuffed her, then proceeded to rape and strangle her. A few weeks later, Bundy drove 60 miles from Salt Lake City to visit her remains. On April 6, 1975, 25-year-old Denise Lynn Oliverson, while riding her bike through Utah-Colorado border, she disappeared. Her sandals were discovered near a railroad bridge. Bundy later said she threw her body in the Colorado River, but they were never found. On May 6, 1974, 12-year-old Lynette Dawn Culver from Alameda Junior High School in Idaho was lured by Ted to his hotel room, where he drowned and essayed her before disposing her body in a river. She was never found. On June 28, 1975, Susan Curtis vanished from the campus of Brigham Young University. Her remains were never found. On August 16, 1975, Utah officer Bob Haywood spotted Ted driving in a residential area. As soon as Ted saw the police car, he fled the scene. The cop eventually caught up to him though, and he was pulled over and arrested right then and there. The officer realized that the passenger seat in his Volkswagen Beetle was missing, or it was either missing or in the back seat. He also seen a ski mask, another mask made of pantyhose, a crowbar, handcuffs, trash bags, ropes, an ice pick, and way more. They searched Ted's apartment, but they couldn't really find anything in there, so they had to let him go as there was no evidence to prove that he did anything wrong with these items. In September of 1975, Ted sold his Volkswagen to get rid of evidence, but luckily the police impounded it and searched the car. They found Karen Campbell's hair strands of Melissa Smith and Carol DeRonch. They finally had evidence linking him to the disappearances. On October 2nd, 1975, Ted was put into a lineup and Carol DeRonch identified him. With this, they had enough evidence to charge him with the kidnapping and assault of Carol. In February of 1976, Ted stood trial for the kidnapping of Carol DeRonch. He was found guilty. In June, he was sentenced to 1 to 15 years in prison. In October, he was discovered hiding in the bushes in the prison yard, carrying road maps, airline schedules, and a social security card, planning his escape. He was put in solitary confinement for weeks. Later that same month, with the new evidence from his car, Colorado police were now able to charge him with the murder of Karen Campbell. On June 7, 1977, Ted had his preliminary hearing, I might be saying that wrong, and decided he was going to serve as his own attorney. During the break, he asked if he can go to the library to review his case, and they agreed. Once they got into the library and the cop turned his back for a second, Ted jumped from a second-story window and from the library and escaped. He hiked to Aspen, breaking into a cabin, stealing food and clothes and whatever he needed. And a rifle, by the way. He also took a rifle. On June 10, 1977, he broke into a trailer on Maroon Lake, stole more food and other supplies, and made his way back to Aspen. 3 days later, Ted stole a car, and a cop noticed his erratic driving and pulled him over and captured him. Bundy, back in jail, got hold of floor plans of the whole jail, a huge blade from other inmates. Ted managed to saw a hole in the roof of his cell to plan his escape. He intentionally lost 35 pounds to be able to crawl through his little hole and through the crawl space. Then, on December 30th, 1977, he escaped from prison once again. He stole another car, but eventually it broke down. A motorist gave him a ride to Colorado. He then took a bus to Denver, where he flew to Chicago, Illinois. Back at the jail, nobody realized that he broke out until the next day at noon. 17 hours later. Once in Chicago, he took a train to Ann Arbor, Michigan, where he stayed there until January 2nd, 1978. 5 days later, he stole another car and drove to Atlanta before boarding a bus to Tallahassee. I might be saying that wrong too. On January 15th, 1978, Ted broke into a sorority house at 2:45 a.m. Ted beat 21-year-old Margaret Bowman with a piece of firewood, then proceeded to choke her with a nylon stocking. He then entered 20-year-old Lisa Levy's room, beat her unconscious, strangled her, tore one of her nipples off, bit into her left butt cheek, and essayed her with a bottle. He then attacked Kathy Kleiner, broke her jaw and gave her a laceration on her shoulder, then beat Karen Chandler, breaking her jaw and giving her a concussion. After leaving, Ted broke into Cheryl Thomas's place and attacked her, dislocating her shoulder and fractured her skull and jaw in 5 places. She luckily survived, but with permanent brain damage and deafness. On her bed, semen was found, as long as a pantyhose with 2 hairs still inside. On February 8, 1978, Ted stole another car driving to Jacksonville, Florida. There he saw 14-year-old Leslie Parmenter, the daughter of a police chief. He approached her but quickly fled after her brother saw him and stood up to him, then headed to Lake City. Next morning, on February 9th, 12-year-old Kimberly Diane Leach went missing at her school. Her remains were found 12 weeks later in a pig farrowing shed in Sewin River State Park. I'm butchering all these names. I'm sorry. I'm trying my best. She was arred and murdered. Her underwear was found containing semen. On February 12, 1978, Ted stole a car, leaving his apartment forever in Tallahassee. 3 days later, at 1 a.m., he was stopped by another police officer named David Lee. The officer quickly realized that his car was stolen, so tried to arrest him. He kicked the officer and ran. David Lee shot at him twice, missing both times, and then tackling him. And then eventually, after a struggle, David got on top of him and arrested him. Inside the stolen car, they found 21 credit cards that were stolen and 3 sets of IDs belonging to women. David Lee, the cop, had no idea that he just arrested FBI's most wanted fugitive. During the Florida trial, he gave a fake name, Kenneth Meisner. He was held in jail, but the police knew that it was a fake name. There was another guy named Kenneth Meisner. He just took his name. Ted eventually told them that if he was able to call his girlfriend Elizabeth, he will tell the cops his real name. In June of 1979, he stood trial for the sorority house murders. He decided that he was going to defend himself. Ted was given a plea deal. If he pled guilty, he would be spared the death sentence. He would have gotten 75 years in prison. He refused this, saying that he was innocent. After 7 hours of deliberation, Ted was found guilty. Ted was found guilty of murder and 2 counts of burglary. In January of 1980, Ted stood for his second trial in Orlando for the murder of Kimberly Leach. After 8 hours of deliberation, he was found guilty. After questioning Caroline Boone, he proposed to her during the court. Like, even though he was found guilty, he still proposed. She accepted.
You want to marry me? And I want to marry you. And I do want to marry you.
Ted was sentenced to death by electrocution. In October of 1981, Caroline, or Carolyn, whatever her name is, gave birth to her daughter. Ted was the father. And then on January 24th, 1989, Ted Bundy was finally executed. I don't like the death penalty. I live in Canada. There's no death penalty over here. And I like that. I like that there's no death penalty. But if you're murdering people like this, I am all for it. He deserved what he had gotten to him. Hope you guys enjoyed today's video. If you like this type of content, please consider subscribing. It'll mean so much to me. And I'll see you guys next Friday. Love you guys. Bye. I do that to my old channel. I need to make a new outro. Anyways, bye.